Right, so we'll just start because time is clicking once we have three
Oh,
people
really?
uh, here, whether we're recording or not. But yeah, I was just about to say that DSA and working families seem to work together well, and that DSA like has a lot of like grassroots support, and like they do well with the ground game and getting folks to like volunteer and knock on doors, and very like they're very good at that. They're very like disciplined and know how to run a ground game very well. And then WFP is strategic in how we run our races and like build power and like don't act as like a spoiler party, whether it's like choosing strong Democrats or primarying corporate Democrats out of there, um, or using like the fusion voting system that they have in some states where we can cross endorse good candidates.
It's interesting to see the requirements involved with choosing candidates. That's partly why I thought it was even a good question to kind of popcorn around there with the Zap, is that, do we really need to be qualified officials as legislators to exercise in the communal developments of equity and operate under true family values? And that's kind of been my thing to really focus on, is what I could do. I met legislator John Cooper at one point. I know this is probably a while back. I'm not sure what involvement he has in politics at the moment. But for a class, we did a little presentation in the legislator's office, and we discussed the cell phone bill, like what it was like to like put out a bill that got people, fined in some cases for having a phone while driving. And debated the subject matter, and it's a distraction. It impairs your ability to drive, and these are lives at risk. Driving a car is a weapon in some cases. You hit somebody, it's vehicular manslaughter. So when I brought a lot of these points up, and I talked to, because some of my fellow classmates thought it was a bad thing to do, like people shouldn't get fined for it. But the way I spoke to it about the family values, about, imagining what it's like to lose someone's life because somebody had to answer a text or a phone call. John Cooper pointed out to me, he said, the way that you approach that with compassion, and you put yourself in the shoes of someone that you may not have, ever been before, that's what it takes to be up here, to be on the stand, to represent large groups of people, is to exercise that compassion. And he inspired me a lot. I was like, you know what? Maybe this is something I can do. So coming out of high school, I always kind of kept in the back of my mind, like, what does it mean to be a representative, to be a legislator, to be an alderman, to be a senator, to be any of these political positions? And, could I just do a local campaign without actually being these people? Could I promote bike paths? Could I open up the door for the lemonade stands again? Could I inspire people to focus on core family values and not get lost in the sauce of all these social conflicts? And I feel like I've set some examples, as best as I can. And I often say there's only so little we can do. So we got to do every little thing we can. And I'll popcorn that to you because I love the Working Families Party perspective.
Well, yeah, I was going to say one thing I've seen people do on a grassroots level is just bring a whole bunch of your neighbors down to a capitol and lobby. You can have like a lobby day, and the more numbers they see you with, the more they're going to see that as a voting block. Now, if you have an actual number for them, like, hey, you see 40 of us right now or 30 of us right now, but we actually represent a voting block of 1,000 in this district, that could be enough to like move them, on certain issues.
Good with that.
So I've seen people do it for things that I didn't necessarily agree with, but it was effective for them. There were a bunch of anti-vaxxers in the Capitol in not Portland, Oregon. I think it was Eugene, Oregon, and they were talking to legislators and there were like a bunch of them that all came down. It was a little bit scary being in a smaller space with them. Um, I could tell like they definitely, they definitely didn't believe in vaccines, and some of them were just like they were just like a little bit rough around the edges and whatnot. But these were people who were all lobbying together as like families, and it was like a big like neighborhood thing. So you can totally do stuff like that, and not be a legislator per se if you can organize your folks.
Where was this Flav there that you saw anti-vaxxers? I know you mentioned what?
This was the capital. This was the capital of Oregon. So I believe that's Eugene, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
And you were there, and like you said it was scary to be in the same room as them.
Well, yeah, because like we were taking like elevators and stuff, and like, I'm not trying to be like mean or insensitive, but
no, it's not mean at all. I would too.
Yeah, and like some of them just they kind of like smelled a bit, and like just this idea that there were all of these people in these enclosed spaces that didn't believe in like vaccinating their kids. I'm like, free speech is free speech is like one thing, but there should have been a way to vet this. Like I wasn't comfortable. I'm like, I think I like didn't take an elevator. What's that?
You were vaccinated though.
Right? I am, but that's not how. It's more complicated than that. There's like a whole herd. There's like a whole thing where even if you're vaccinated, if there are enough people like in the area who are not, it's still, I don't know how to scientifically explain it, but it's still a thing.
The issue is that there. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was saying there's a few studies, but it's a very big subject. Definitely more than a 40-minute discussion. It's interesting.
But the prevailing science, which is what I depend on, is like it's still like a thing. Like you want as many people to be vaccinated as possible, and just because you're vaccinated, it doesn't necessarily protect you, especially if you're in a group of people.
And the issue with herd immunity also is that there's always going to be a small number of people who, for some medical condition, won't be able to get vaccinated. And as long as everyone who is able to get vaccinated does, it allows for that very small number of people not to. And it also protects those who are elderly, those who are immunocompromised. So I just think as a society, we have to think about other people, and we have to have concern for other people's health. I mean, this is the same argument over masks and everything. I'm really just disturbed by how many people are willing to be completely reckless and not care about whether others live or die. It's just what I find to be an incredibly cruel streak in this country.
I think it's denial. Like I think it's hard for people to imagine something that they can't see. I think it really comes down to that. Like even if it's not being admitted in those words, I think like especially like a lot of the young people in Florida, and for some reason it's always Florida, which I don't know.
I can only take so much responsibility, Flav.
You must have seen me looking at you.
I can see you. You're like Florida, those Cubans, those guys over there. That guy, quick, get him.
But yeah, it's something about like if you can't see it and you can't feel it immediately, and this whole idea that it can be latent for 14 days and you're passing it and you don't even know you can have it. We're just like humans aren't really built that way to like understand those kind of concepts, and we live like such like
it's complex.
We live like these material lives where like we can't touch it and feel it. Like it's hard for us to believe it exists. I don't. Yeah, it's complex. And then you have young people who just feel invincible, anyways. And then you've got some religious folks who believe they're protected.
See, why aren't you looking at Joey now? You mentioned young people. He's the youngest guy here. You're a hypocrite, Flav. You just look at me.
I'm definitely looking at Joey.
Yeah. No, I think there's crazy people of all ages. I mean, a lot of the
Yeah.
loudest anti-vaxxers, for instance, seem to be middle-aged Karens. But to your point also about how we sometimes can't really actually have a legitimate fear of what we can't perceive or can't see. I think that a large part of that is because it's not within living memory. Like it's been over a century since the last time something like this happened,
Right.
and the timeline of that epidemic was almost exactly the same as this one. The similarities are staggering, and it's commonplace for people to wear masks in the midst of a pandemic. If something like this had happened while survivors of the 1919 pandemic or just people who had lived during it were still alive, then it would be easier for people to say, "Oh yeah, Grandpa told me about when he
Right.
wore a mask." But
Right.
we don't have that. But really, if you go back to the time of the Black Death, social distancing and mask wearing and quarantines have always been how these things have been handled, and closing public gatherings. I mean, this is really nothing new.
Sure. No, I mean, you're totally right about that. And hey, you saw that back in 1919, they had the Anti-Mask Society,
Yeah.
right? And I think they were doing the same thing. They were like hanging out, throwing parties, like not taking the shit seriously. And unfortunately, they saw a lot more deaths than,
Yeah.
we're seeing now.
It's true.
I wonder if they had a leader that they were like blaming for how it was handled, or if it was just seen as this like horrible thing that no one knew
To
how to.
speak on behalf of that time period, they were going through a lot of wild changes. I mean, you have the introduction of radio waves and new technology they've never seen before, and a lot of things that had them look in all sorts of ways for answers, and ultimately just kind of experiencing perhaps the first large step in what we now know as the human condition, which is where they were, experiencing some really wild times. I mean, even when you think about it, the government was reclaiming gold around this time, if I'm not mistaken, and people were being hung from trees, if I'm not mistaken. There was like some serious, terrible stuff going on.
The seizure of gold didn't happen. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that didn't happen until the 30s. But yeah, I mean, people were getting hung. I mean, that was right. That was several years after the release of Birth of a Nation, and the Ku Klux Klan had a revival. So yeah, that was a very dark time.
So the Spanish flu kind of, in some cases, took a back seat for some people. And even in the time when it first was noted at that Naval Radio Command Center, I mean, they didn't even want to report it because they thought it would hurt the morale of the war times they were going through. And of course, Spain, not really involved in the war, was like, hey, we need help because we've never seen anything like this. And then whoever smelt it dealt it, and now it's the Spanish flu in this case. But at the same time, like, was wearing the mask and the Spanish flu the biggest problem they were facing, or was it the newest thing they ever saw? It did start the studies for virology, and it did start a lot of the original theories for contagion that we operate under, like Joey was mentioning, quarantine. I mean, this isn't new. Social distancing, this isn't new. The masks aren't, none of this is new. This is all old stuff. We want to talk about some funny new stuff. We could talk about asymptomatic carrier studies. We could talk about all sorts of other frontier studies that have not been complete because the funding didn't exactly go towards fixing the problem, but maybe, if I were to suggest as an opinion, went towards trying to weaponize some of these things too. And now that's a stretch, and I'm just making that as an opinionated point.
Wait, so what? To weaponize what?
Well, to take something like a virus and study it, and the first attempt we would imagine would be to cure the virus, to help people, to make vaccines. And they did provide vaccines, and they did provide some cures eventually down the road. But the continued funding and the studies that went into this still have not tapped into some of the original theories of contagion. There are still things on the table that we question, which is why the World Health Organization is giving us these seemingly mixed, matched suggestions, but they're really not mixed or matched. They're just drawing from theories of contagion and what we've seen before, like the typhoid Mary thing. I mean, we've seen a typhoid Mary happen where there's an asymptomatic carrier that spreads this horrible illness rapidly. But when you look at other studies through other viruses and other conditions, the asymptomatic carrier does not have a high percentage of spread. In fact, them being able to control the symptoms typically prevents the spread, which they later end up admitting that it's a small percentage, still a percentage nonetheless. But where are the new studies? Why do we have level 4 biosafety facilities that are handling these deadly viruses, but we do not have level 4 safety practices in our society? How come we don't have a better way to have translated this to the people, knowing these risks are so high? I think in 2018, they were even asked, and by they, I'm not entirely sure what lab, but it was mentioned that, listen, these are dangerous things. We need to stop messing with this. I mean, we've seen stuff come out of, what is it, Plum Island, Montauk Project stuff. We've heard a lot of weird things, but we've never really heard, a cease and desist. We've never really heard a
the scientific studies show that this COVID was not like a man-made thing and would have been very difficult for it to have been, but it was something that I think kind of came out naturally, or from proximity to animals, and animals that are more prone to have diseases that we weren't really ready to bear the brunt of.
What's the Montauk Project? Elaborate on that a little bit, Damien.
Well, this was just going into some things that I've heard about, studies that spun off of some of what Tesla was doing in Montauk, and then people had taken some of these studies and they end up experimenting on nature, and we find a few anomalies. It's not something I'm too certain of, I have to say, from opinion and from belief and from words. I don't have much to back that with. That's a good thing to look into. Not something I could imagine we would fit into a conversation. In fact, I'm not really sure what we were supposed to direct the conversation towards, but we would end up going through a lot of rabbit-sized wormholes to surface some of this information. I just wanted to throw out perhaps some of those original theories of contagion, and to mention that we, for 100-year-long study, I feel like as a society, we're a little underprepared, because again, these are these are old methods of social distancing that people are wowed by and they don't understand, but that's always been the case. So shouldn't there have been a better method by now, or a better understanding by now? That's kind of why I tapped into this a little bit as a question.
Well, certainly the Obama administration had some very strong protocols in place that 45, decided to burn or throw away out of spite or out of ignorance, for sure.
Or all the above.
Well, yeah, or meaning also and logic.
Yeah, we absolutely need to do a better job of funding medical research. We need to fully fund the CDC, and I just think I think that scientific research really hasn't been prioritized enough by the government. I mean, that's why I would support. It's another reason I would support a Green New Deal. I think that would include a lot of money for scientific research and medical. Medical research is different, but I think that if we had a system of universal health care, obviously that it would. I guess is kind of an unrelated topic, but we wouldn't see millions of people losing their health insurance because they lost their jobs as a result of that. And I guess that is connected in a sense, because it speaks to some of the wariness, possibly that people had about being forced to not work, yet then at the same by order of the government, yet then at the same time not having their their standard of living fully provided for, not having guaranteed access to healthcare. I mean, it's really messed up. And also the fact that people aren't having their rent and mortgage payments totally forgiven, the fact that they're being evicted through no fault of their own, the fact that anybody could defend that is just a fucking travesty. And the fact that that's going on is disgusting.
Yeah, it's the downside of hyper capitalism. I mean, we should have, if any nation in the world should have been able to afford to protect its people and put us in the safest situation possible, it should have been the U.S. instead of, having people decide this catch-22 style, question of, do I go back to work and risk everything, or do I stay home and risk not having a home,
Yeah, I'm actually currently protesting, in some respect, you could say, the return to work orders. And all I'm doing is reading some of the executive order suggestions with some of the OSHA establishments and moratoriums, I should say, and some of the work agreements that we have with the union. So I'm fortunate enough to be in a union where I can, take these orders and kind of read them to each other and explain to the shop, hey, listen, I have some questions that I need you to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they're given some questions like about medical measures and practices and, what they're going to do in scenario A, B, C, or D, and they can't answer that question, and then they send me to the hall and I ask them questions about the work agreement and how it covers us in these emergency conditions in these situations, and they don't want to answer that question, and I'm left kind of in the middle with some of these OSHA moratoriums, which prove that we're in an emergency condition because there are moratoriums that are pushing some older rules aside so that they could bring some newer rules to the table just for these emergency situations. And they mentioned to me that I'm one of the only people in the union that has brought this up, that have asked these questions. And I feel a little concerned. I feel like other people should be asking these questions. If, your job is involving some kind of, a close space, unsafe condition with this issue going on with the virus, and perhaps some other issues on the table too. I think it's that we need to be asking questions, and nobody's asking questions. They're just kind of going along with it, going with the flow. Because like Joey mentioned, there are rent payments and bill payments, and I guess, Flavia, you're calling it hyper-capitalism. It's putting this grand social pressure on us where we absolutely feel that it's essential for us to perform non-essential services and not have a means to fall back on, a society we built, a gross domestic production that is ranked, number 2 or 3 in the world of gross domestic production. I mean, you would think
so, yeah,
that we would have some kind of means to fall back on when it comes to the relationship between producers, consumers, and these corporate entities, the free market, if you will.
Yeah, I think a universal system and solid leadership would give us, a unilateral way of looking at things. So it's not like this town over here or this municipality over here or this state over here is deciding this thing. I think, there should be like one scientific accord that's able to look at different situations and say, hey, this part of the South is doing super well, but they should stay where they are and no one should travel anywhere else. And if we want to lax things a little bit, there's going to be a certain risk, but that still means social distancing and mask wearing and as limited time exposed to each other as possible. We have the technology. Use your Zoom. Don't send kids to school. I mean, I don't know why you would want to play with any of this stuff. Now it's not even 6 degrees of separation. Like, everyone knows someone who's died of COVID, pretty much. So it's not like, I don't know why we would play around with this stuff.
Yeah, a lot of the question that's hard for them is when I ask the risk versus the reward. And I ask them, what are the risk levels? Because it's not a worker's fault that this is a problem. It's an engineering and administrative concern. So
Yeah.
when it comes to OSHA regulations, when we're talking about, things that roll downhill, I mean, this is a big problem at the top, and it's being shoveled over to us like it's our problem in the field. And
Oh,
I
sure.
pointed out to them that there's administrative details that they could engineer more efficiently to meet these guidelines and to provide safer environments with less risk. And nobody likes being told what to do, especially from someone like me. I'm low man on the totem pole in my line of work. So
They'll
very,
have someone. They'll have someone that looks like you in the commercial when they're showing like how well they're treating their workers, and you know how much the folks at the top care, and how much we should be, frequenting the business because
well,
they
they
care
are,
about the workers.
to speak for my union, they are doing better than a lot of other places. There are non-union workers. I actually just spoke to some linesmen that were repairing some lines from the damages from the storm. And I asked them a few questions about, how their regulations and terms are going and what their work agreements say about it. And they're getting probably the worst end of the deal, but their work is essential. So of course, I thank them with a lot of gratitude for what they did. I was fortunate enough to not be in a situation where I lost power for very long at all, but like understanding the importance of that essential service. But then looking at some other workers in non-essential situations and saying, like, this is where we need to take our vote with the dollar. Like you're saying, like we should be not, consuming from these places or establishments that are not taking human life seriously, and
I
that are.
agree, and I do think that what you're doing in terms of asking questions and trying to hold them accountable is so vital, because they're already, like, just small bit of good news is that we've already seen that has an effect, and labor power has an effect. The Chicago Teachers Union threatened a citywide strike, and the mayor gave in and agreed to not have in-person school for the fall semester.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, people coming together like that. Like we never needed to be legislators, but we needed to ask questions. Like we were representing something bigger than us. And that's my thing. I could go to work. I survived through the city all the way up to March 31st when they finally declared the commercial building non-essential. But like in the heat of the storm with the city shutting down and the trains rescheduling and all this stuff, I was able to survive very successfully. I had some steps and measures and methods and safety controls that, I took to a personal protective level, knowing that my administrators and my engineers were failing me. And I could do it again. I'm healthy, I'm fit, I could be out there doing it, but I know that there's people that are not. And I know
Wait,
that
you were in New York City before, you were saying, when this stuff
correct.
was
Yeah,
going on?
I work in Manhattan. That's the
Oh, okay.
jurisdiction that I work in Manhattan, the 5 boroughs.
Okay. But you live on Long Island, or?
Correct. I live in East North Port Island, middle of North Shore area.
Okay.
And that's what I mean by, like, I have to kind of speak to represent something bigger than myself a little here, because of course I know family members, friends of family members that suffer from immunocompromised disorder, not disorders, issues, and it gets very complicated. But I feel that because I'm in a position to ask for representation, to ask these questions, that I should and I will. Until the very last minute, they're trying to get me for non-compliance at a certain point, so I sent a letter in with my next dues payment, and I always pay ahead a little bit over. I always have good standings with the international membership. But when I sent the letter to be certified, I did ask for a response letter. I've sent other letters in the past that they have not responded to, but this one I made sure was a certified mailing letter that you have to sign for, because I need to be able to share transparent accountability, since I have to take on individual responsibilities. And that's been a weird message, and I love learning more about that this year. That's been probably the biggest takeaway from this emergency condition.
And when you say they and the letters you're sending, you mean to your company?
Correct.
To your
You would say my employer, which
to
is
your employer. Okay.
an international membership in a union. And then I'm going to be sending another letter to my local representation in the union as well, with progress reports from the previous work I had been doing up until March 31st.
Okay.
Yeah, it's I'll keep updated on that too. This is a very interesting situation because weirdly enough, I truly do feel like I might be one of the only people actually asking the question and making a stand and taking the risk of losing this career, of losing whatever it is that I have. At a certain point, I feel that, you know, we as a whole, as a society, we have things that make it difficult because we have something to lose. But individually, there's sacrifices that we can make, and you know, I'm willing to share in those sacrifices a little bit. Of course, I think about, you know, my cat. As silly as that might sound, I have to take care of my cat. There's things that do depend on me, even some friends and family members that I share with that do depend on us being able to stay fit and healthy and take care of each other. But at a certain point, it's become a matter of principle, and I would like to see more people exercise those principles, the family values, and ask these questions not just for themselves, but for others who may not know how to ask those questions.
What about your coworkers that are in the union with you?
Right. So that's the unique circumstance that's kind of being pointed out here, and I mentioned a little bit of it in a previous conversation, but since 1971, you could say that unions and the international membership and representation have been taking steps backwards, which is to say we've been giving back to a lot of companies and corporations to try and recover work that we have lost to non-union, but really also on a larger scale, automation. And that's talking about factory work, and that's talking about assembly lines in the automotive industry. But as far as it goes in the construction industry, there's been a lot of competitive turnovers and a lot of trade secrets that were lost. So non-union was able to actually take some of what the union was doing that guaranteed us 33%, like a third of the labor force. And then after we let in a bunch of new people that said, I don't like it, they took some of these trade secrets and brought them to non-union for a little pretty penny. And the non-union competitors were able to sweep up a lot more jobs once they learned some of our union trade secrets. And
so,
now,
but simply put, do you have other union folks that are working with
they're
you
scared.
at your job?
Yeah, they're terrified to ask
okay.
these questions. Many
Okay, so you're the only one. You're the only one.
The fact that I'm an apprentice in my ending year, I got one more year going in my apprenticeship, it actually protects me. Whereas a journeyman would get potentially laid off just for asking a question, just for being a problem. They would just send them back to the hall.
Does your union have like regular meetings or?
They have meetings. In these meetings for apprenticeship, we're not really, we're meant to take the information in and the numbers. We're not really meant to go up on a open mic and speak on behalf of any of these issues. As a journeyman, of course, there is an open mic Monday meeting where you would come and you would speak about some of the things happening in your shop or in the hall. But again, these people get silenced in many different ways and get buried by a lot of different tactics, if you will, a lot of politics that happen in internal affairs, names getting lost on lists, people being out of work for 26, 28 weeks at a time, losing their homes, having to refinance and get new homes because they weren't able to make enough work in the year, which is also a little bit living beyond the means for some of these people, but also to speak on the behalf of people that weren't living beyond their means. I mean, they just literally expected to make $75,000 in the year, you know, as a prevailing waged electrician, and then ended up losing too much work, only making 40, 50,000 in the year. I mean, this has happened to people, but it's because they asked questions, because they refused an unsafe condition, because they were non-compliant. And for a journeyman, they could just give them a reduction, but for an apprentice, they have to write out a whole report, because of course I'm there to learn. So they can't say, oh, he was unfit, or oh, we didn't need him. So because I'm playing the role of the cheap labor that helps push the projects along and is there to learn field work about this new career, it's harder for them to just simply fire me. They have to come up with a reason and they have to write a report. So I've gotten away with some of these questions that others can't.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It's probably not all that important, but I was thinking, Damien, about what you were saying about non-union competitors and how they've sort of cut into the business. Because I remember when I was living in Brooklyn at one point, there was a demolition going on right next door to my building, and it was I mean, it would be hilarious, like comical, if it wasn't so tragic. There were these construction workers that were literally wearing what looked like kids' Fisher-Price helmets, and I figured that was probably a non-union, low-wage construction crew.
I mean, this is actually something that's good to speak on, is that some non-union companies do have a lot of PPE, but it's not always the best, and protective personal equipment is where a lot of corners do get cut in an attempt for an administrative or engineered personnel, or we could just say a foreman, to try and get some extra money from a job estimate. So it's true, that's a sad corner to be cut or to be lost. And it's against, you know, this is really what OSHA talks about, is if there's better equipment available, it should be provided. And if the worker knows how to ask for it, then it's included with the personal protective equipment agreements. And it oftentimes gets dismissed. And that's, I mean, yet another huge topic we could go further into that affects working families. And I feel like it goes very underrepresented in a lot of areas. Unions have kind of become like, in some cases, babysitters that we've outgrown, because non-union can bargain for themselves. They can say, hey, listen, I want a better deal. They don't always need the other representative. So my question comes back to that other one too. Do I need to be a business agent to represent my work agreement? Or could I just be a worker who stands by family values and communal equity in the international membership? They'll say brotherhood, but of course we have sisters too.
Well, I mean, as long as the union's got your back, there's just strength in numbers there, right? And it's like your job may fear, you know, dozens and dozens or hundreds of workers internationally bound together in a recognized union than just a few of you at your job. So that might be something there. Your union also might come with some lawyers who know, you know, some ins and some outs to help, and might be able to recommend, like, hey, this looks like retaliation. That's illegal, especially when you're in a recognized union. Folks are being paid less for asking questions. If you document that, that sounds like that's retaliation. Go to the NLRB, and you know they might eat that up. You know, who knows? So I would definitely ask them about retaliation and what the implications are.
Yeah, and that's why it's such a complicated question when you ask me, well, do I have fellow coworkers? Do I have other people that are going to ask these questions with me? And
Yeah.
I actually did. I had a whole floor do this with me, and it led to a 30-person layoff. They laid off a whole floor of people because everybody asked the question that I brought up out of the work agreement. It was 30 journeymen and 3 apprentices, all laid off. And of course, they went out to hire for more people from the hall. But this situation got dismissed, and it's a little disheartening. But it let me know.
Do you want to name on here what business that is, or do you not want to name the business?
Oh no, we're gonna have to wait for that on
Okay.
another event. Yes,
Sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and we're running out of time, but this has been great. I think we got a lot out of these 2 sessions. So yeah, thank you guys again for coming on. I think this format worked really, really well.
Actually,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure talking with you and getting to jog these ideas around as a group. You know,